breaking news update in the story of the missing 2-year-old girl from Enterprise. There are new charges. Police say the toddler's mother's story is not quite adding up, leading to more questions.
Police have been looking for Genesis on the account of her mother, who says when she looked for Genesis in bed, she was no longer there and a door to the home was open. However, as the investigation continued and more questions arose, police have come to the conclusion that Adrian is not being truthful. Then she told police of a new character in the case, known only by the name Mariah, who frequents a local bar. In a press conference today, District Attorney James Tarbox explained, because Reid is charged with a Class C felony, there is no set bond before she goes before a judge, but they will be asking for a substantial bond at that point. Now,
at 3 a.m., in a quiet apartment complex in Enterprise, Alabama, a mother dialed 911 and said the words no parent should ever have to say. "My baby is gone." She told police she had woken up in the middle of the night. Her 2-year-old daughter, Genesis Nova Reid, was not in her bed. The front door, she claimed, was open. The apartment was dark, silent, empty. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights washed over the walls of the Meadowbrook Apartments on Apache Drive. Officers knocked on doors. Neighbors stepped outside in pajamas and house slippers. A toddler had vanished into the Alabama night. But what started as a frantic search for a missing child would quickly unravel into something far more disturbing. Because within 48 hours, the story changed. And the woman who made that 3 a.m. call would be sitting in handcuffs. This is the case of 2-year-old Genesis Nova Reid, the missing toddler whose disappearance shook Enterprise, Alabama, and the shocking twist that led to her own mother's arrest. Police say Genesis was reported missing in the early hours of February 16, 2026. According to her mother, 33-year-old Adrian Reid, she had put her daughter to bed as usual. Sometime during the night, she woke up and discovered Genesis was gone. An open door, a missing child, no signs of forced entry. The situation was urgent. Officers immediately began searching the surrounding area. Patrol units canvassed the complex. K-9 teams were deployed. Investigators questioned neighbors. Word spread quickly across social media. A 2-year-old girl in pink Minnie Mouse pajamas had disappeared. But almost immediately, the detectives began to notice something unsettling. The timeline didn't feel right. Neighbors quietly told officers something that would change the direction of the investigation. Some claimed they hadn't seen Genesis in weeks. Not days, weeks. As police continued their interviews, inconsistencies in Adrian Reid's statements reportedly began to surface. Details didn't line up. Time frames shifted, answers changed, and behind the scenes, investigators began focusing not just on where Genesis might be, but on when she was last truly seen. Then came the first major turning point. On February 17th, just one day after Genesis was reported missing, Adrian Reid was arrested. Not for homicide, not for kidnapping, but for false reporting to law enforcement. Authorities announced they had reason to believe the missing child report was not truthful. The very call that launched the massive search effort was now under scrutiny. And then, during a court appearance, something chilling allegedly happened. According to reports from the courtroom, Adrian Reid turned toward law enforcement and said 2 words, "I'm sorry." Sorry for what? That question has haunted this case ever since. The Coffee County District Attorney later stated publicly that Adrian Reid was, at that time, the only known suspect in the disappearance of Genesis Nova Reid. He emphasized that investigators believed she was the only person who knew where the little girl was. Her bond was set at $1 million, cash only. Meanwhile, Genesis was still missing. Search efforts intensified. Those authorities brought in additional resources. A cadaver K-9 unit was used during search operations in and around the apartment complex. Investigators expanded their focus beyond the night of February 16th. They began reconstructing a much larger timeline. Police publicly asked anyone who had seen or interacted with Adrienne Reid between December 24th, 2025, and February 16th, 2026, to come forward. Why that window of time? What happened between Christmas and that early morning 911 call? And perhaps most haunting of all, when was the last time Genesis Nova Reid was actually seen alive? Another mysterious detail emerged during the investigation. Authorities began searching for a woman known as Mariah or Mariah, described as a person of interest who might have key information in the case. Officials clarified she was not a suspect at the time, but they believed she could help answer critical questions. As the days passed, the tension in Enterprise grew heavier. A missing toddler, a mother under arrest, an apology in court, a timeline filled with gaps, and a child who has still not been found. This is not just the story of a disappearance. It's the story of a 3 a.m. phone call that may not have told the whole truth. It's the story of investigators trying to piece together what really happened behind closed apartment doors. And it's the story of two words, "I'm sorry," that may mean more than anyone yet understands. Before we go further, we need to carefully walk through exactly what police say happened that night, and what they discovered in the hours and days that followed. See, because once you see how the timeline unfolds, the questions become even more disturbing. The first thing investigators did after that 3 a.m. call was lock down the scene. When officers stepped inside the apartment on Apache Drive, they weren't just looking for a lost child. They were looking for signs. Signs of forced entry, signs of struggle, signs of panic, signs that matched the urgency in the mother's voice. Adrienne Reid told them she had woken up and noticed Genesis wasn't in her bed. She said the front door was open. She said she didn't know how long it had been open. She said she didn't hear anything during the night. For a parent of a 2-year-old, that detail alone was unsettling. Toddlers don't usually slip silently out of homes in the dead of night. They cry. They make noise. They struggle with locks. They trip, but no broken windows, no shattered locks. No broken windows, no shattered locks, no visible disturbance suggesting a stranger had burst in and abducted a child. Outside, patrol units swept the complex. They checked stairwells, dumpsters, playgrounds, parking areas, wooded patches nearby. Every dark corner that could hide a toddler wandering alone in the night. Time was critical. In missing child cases, especially involving children under 5, the first hours are everything. As the search expanded, detectives began doing what they always do in cases like this. They started asking questions. When was the last time Genesis was seen? Adrienne reportedly told officers she had put Genesis to bed the night before. See, she couldn't give a precise time when she last checked on her. She maintained she believed her daughter had been in the apartment when she went to sleep. But as investigators spoke with neighbors, something began to shift. Several residents reportedly told police they hadn't seen Genesis in weeks. Some allegedly said they couldn't remember the last time they saw her playing outside. Others claimed it may have been around Christmas. That detail didn't immediately prove anything. After all, Not every neighbor closely tracks the movements of a 2-year-old in their building. But when multiple people begin saying the same thing, that they hadn't seen the child recently, investigators take note. Detectives began reconstructing a timeline beyond just that night. They asked for phone records. They looked at digital activity. They examined surveillance footage from nearby buildings and businesses. They reviewed license plate readers in the area. They analyzed whether any vehicles had come or gone at unusual hours. And then came another key development. Police publicly requested that anyone who had seen or interacted with Adrienne Reid between December 24th, 2025 and February 16th, 2026, contact them. That wasn't random. That meant investigators were now seriously questioning whether Genesis had actually disappeared that night, or whether something had happened much earlier. Behind the scenes, interviews with Adrienne reportedly continued. In missing child investigations, especially when there are no signs of forced entry, the primary caregiver is almost always interviewed extensively. Not because they are automatically guilty, but because statistically, when very young children disappear from inside a home without signs of intrusion, the answer is usually closer than it appears. According to official statements released later, detectives identified inconsistencies in Adrienne's account. Details about the timeline reportedly shifted. Statements did not align cleanly with physical evidence or witness claims. Investigators do not arrest someone lightly in a missing child case, especially not within 24 hours. But on February 17, 2026, just one day after Genesis was reported missing, police made their move. Adrienne Reid was charged with false reporting to law enforcement, a felony offense in Alabama. That charge sent shockwaves through the community. It meant authorities had reason to believe the 3 a.m., the emergency call, the call that triggered sirens and search dogs and sleepless neighbors, was not truthful. But here's what made the situation even more disturbing. Genesis was still missing. The false reporting charge did not answer where she was. It did not confirm whether she had been harmed. It did not explain the weeks-long gap neighbors described. It only confirmed one thing. Investigators believed the initial story was not accurate. During her court appearance, bond was set at $1 million, cash only. Prosecutors reportedly argued that she was the only known suspect and that she was the only person believed to know where Genesis was. Those words echoed across news headlines. Only known suspect. And then, according to multiple reports, Adrienne turned toward officers and said, I'm sorry. That statement has become one of the most analyzed moments in this case. What did she mean? Was she apologizing for lying about the timeline? For causing a panic? For misleading police? Or was she apologizing for something far more serious? Investigators have not publicly elaborated on the context of those words, but in a courtroom, when a missing child is still unaccounted for, "I'm sorry" carries weight. While legal proceedings began moving forward, the search for Genesis did not stop. Authorities expanded their efforts. Cadaver K-9 units were deployed in and around the apartment complex. Law enforcement agencies coordinated with state and federal partners. Investigators continued interviewing friends, family members, and associates. And then another name surfaced publicly. A police asked for help locating a woman known as Mariah, described as a person of interest who might have critical information. Officials clarified she was not a suspect at that time, but they believed she could help fill in gaps in the timeline. Why would a separate person of interest matter in a case where the mother is considered the only known suspect? Because investigations are rarely simple. Detectives consider whether anyone else could have assisted, witnessed, or unknowingly participated in events that may have occurred before February 16th. Every text message, every phone call, every ride, every visit. When police ask about a specific date range, from Christmas Eve to mid-February, they are trying to answer one chilling question. When was Genesis last alive? And if neighbors were correct that they hadn't seen her in weeks, that means the disappearance might not have happened overnight. It could mean the 3 a.m. call was not the beginning of the story. It could mean it was the end of something that had already happened. As media coverage intensified, so did speculation. Social media filled with theories. Some accused, some defended, some claimed knowledge without evidence. Police publicly warned against misinformation, emphasizing that spreading rumors could damage the investigation. Meanwhile, inside the jail, Adrian Reid remained held on $1 million bond, and outside, the community of Enterprise wrestled with fear and anger. 2-year-old Genesis Nova Reid, a child described as bright and playful, had vanished. A no Amber Alert had been issued in the initial hours because the circumstances did not immediately confirm an abduction by a stranger. That detail alone fueled public debate. But investigators operate on evidence, not emotion. And the evidence, whatever they uncovered, was strong enough to charge the mother with lying. Chapter 1 of this story isn't about a confirmed crime scene. It's about a shifting narrative, a 911 call that may not have told the whole truth, a timeline that stretches back to Christmas, a courtroom apology, and a little girl who, as of this chapter, has not been found. As detectives continued their work behind closed doors, they began focusing on something even more precise: digital footprints. Because in modern investigations, the truth often hides in data. And what they were about to uncover in the digital timeline would push this case into an even darker direction. By the time the sun rose over Enterprise the morning after the arrest, this was no longer just a missing child case. It had become a timeline investigation. When law enforcement believes a story doesn't align with the evidence, they stop chasing the surface narrative and start dissecting the details underneath it. Every minute matters, every text message, every digital movement, every interaction. Detectives began zeroing in on one central question. If Genesis did not disappear in the early morning hours of February 16th, then when did she? The date range police publicly requested: December 24th, 2025 through February 16th, 2026, was not random. It was deliberate. And that window suggested investigators believed something critical happened somewhere within those 54 days. And that's a long time for a 2-year-old to go unnoticed. Behind closed doors, investigators typically start with the simplest tools first: phone data, cell tower pings, text records, social media activity, banking transactions, rideshare logs, GPS data embedded in apps. A phone rarely lies. If someone claims they were home all night, location data can confirm or contradict that claim. If someone says they last saw a child at bedtime, digital timestamps can sometimes show whether the household was active during odd hours. Police have not publicly released the details of what they recovered digitally. But the speed of the arrest suggests investigators uncovered something significant. Because charging someone with false reporting in a missing child case within 24 hours is not a casual decision. It implies evidence. And that evidence likely came from more than just neighbors saying they hadn't seen Genesis. Investigators reportedly conducted repeated interviews with Adrienne Reid in the hours after the initial report. In cases like this, detectives often revisit the same questions in different ways. They ask for precise times. They ask for sensory details. They ask about ordinary routines. What time did Genesis eat dinner? What time was she bathed? What pajamas was she wearing? Did she cry? Did she wake during the night? Did anyone visit the apartment? Did you leave at any point? Consistency matters. When answers change, even slightly, it raises red flags. According to official statements, the inconsistencies were identified in the mother's account. While police have not detailed each contradiction publicly, the fact that they escalated to felony charges tells us those inconsistencies were not minor. Meanwhile, outside the apartment complex, search operations continued. Cadaver K-9 units were deployed in nearby areas. That decision alone signaled a shift in investigative posture. While police never officially declared the case a homicide investigation at that stage, the use of cadaver dogs indicated they were preparing for the worst. The results of those searches were not immediately released. Authorities stated they did not find anything of evidentiary value in the specific areas searched at that time. But absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. T-end investigators were clearly not limiting their search to the apartment complex alone. The next phase of the investigation turned toward relationships. Who had access to the apartment? Who had been in contact with Adrienne in the weeks prior? Who might have helped move something or someone? That's where the name Moriah, sometimes reported as Mariah, entered the public conversation. Police asked for assistance locating this woman, describing her as someone who may have critical information. They clarified she was not a suspect at that time, but her potential involvement in the timeline suggested she may have interacted with Adrienne during the critical window between Christmas and mid-February. Why would investigators highlight that name publicly? Because in cases like this, law enforcement often applies strategic pressure. When they believe someone knows something but isn't coming forward, making that person's name public can force a response. Did Mariah visit the apartment? Did she help with child care? Did she witness something? Did she assist unknowingly in moving items? Police have not answered those questions publicly. But they clearly believed she was part of the puzzle. As the community absorbed these developments, frustration grew. Genesis had still not been located. The 3 a.m. narrative, the open door, the empty bed, was now clouded by doubt. And the courtroom moment continued to echo. I'm sorry. 2 words that could mean everything or nothing. Legal analysts weighed in. Some argued that apologizing in court could simply reflect regret over causing panic or misleading officers. But others suggested it could be a slip, an emotional crack under pressure. But investigators don't base cases on emotion. They base them on evidence. And whatever evidence they uncovered convinced prosecutors to argue that Adrienne Reid was the only known suspect and the only person believed to know Genesis's whereabouts. That language is powerful. It doesn't say she harmed the child. It doesn't say the child is deceased. But it does say investigators believe the truth is in her possession. As days passed, law enforcement expanded outreach. They urged anyone who had seen Genesis since Christmas to come forward. They requested information about gatherings, social events, casual visits, anything that could establish a confirmed sighting. And that's where the timeline grew even more unsettling. In most households with a 2-year-old, there are digital traces of daily life. Photos, videos, pediatric appointments, grocery store runs, playground outings, texts to relatives, babysitter exchanges. But what if those traces are missing? Investigators would examine whether Genesis had attended daycare, whether she had recent medical appointments, whether there were photographs time-stamped within the critical window, whether neighbors or relatives could confirm seeing her in January or early February. The absence of recent verifiable sightings would support the theory that something happened earlier than February 16th. And if that's true, then the 3 a.m. phone call wasn't the beginning. It was the cover. While authorities remained careful in their public statements, they did confirm one thing. They were building a case beyond the false reporting charge. False reporting can carry serious penalties, but in the context of a missing child, it is often the first stepping stone toward larger charges, if additional evidence supports them. The $1 million cash bond underscored the severity of the situation. That amount is typically reserved for cases where prosecutors believe the defendant poses significant risk, either of flight or of obstructing justice. And still, Genesis was not found. Search teams canvassed wooded areas. Investigators analyzed traffic camera footage. They reviewed surveillance from businesses near Apache Drive. They looked at vehicles entering and leaving during the Christmas to February window. Every mile matters in a case like this. Because if a body or critical evidence was moved, there would likely be a vehicle involved. And vehicles leave trails, gas station cameras, ATM cameras, license plate readers, neighborhood doorbell footage, digital breadcrumbs. The longer investigators worked, the more the case transformed from an emergency response into a forensic puzzle. And then came another subtle shift. Law enforcement began emphasizing social media misinformation. That's usually a sign that rumors are spreading faster than facts. In high-profile missing child cases, online speculation can explode. Some users claim to have insider knowledge. Others share unverified screenshots. Some accuse without evidence. Police warned that spreading false information could hinder the investigation. Which raises another question. What were investigators seeing behind the scenes that the public wasn't? Were there digital messages, private admissions, suspicious searches, unusual travel patterns? Authorities have not released those details publicly, but the urgency and speed of the arrest suggest that this case escalated rapidly behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the emotional weight of the case grew heavier. Genesis was 2 years old, a toddler with no control over her circumstances, a child dependent entirely on adults for safety. And as investigators dug deeper into the digital and physical timeline, one possibility became harder to ignore. If Genesis had not been seen since Christmas, that would mean she was potentially missing before anyone called police. That possibility reframes everything. It transforms the case from a sudden overnight disappearance into something far more disturbing. But before detectives could finalize their conclusions, they needed one more piece: a confirmed last sighting. and what they were about to uncover regarding that final confirmed moment would tighten the timeline in a way that no one expected. Because the truth, as investigators were beginning to see, may not have been hidden in the early morning hours of February 16th. It may have been buried in the quiet days after Christmas, and the person who held the answers was already sitting behind bars. By the beginning of the week, investigators were no longer treating this as a simple missing person case. They were reconstructing a life in reverse. When a child disappears under unclear circumstances, detectives work backward from the last confirmed proof of life. That phrase, proof of life, becomes everything. It isn't based on assumptions. It isn't based on a parent's statement alone. It requires something verifiable. A photo with metadata. A witness who physically saw the child. A medical visit logged in a system. Video footage with a timestamp. In Genesis Nova Reid's case, that proof of life became the central mystery. Police had publicly asked for anyone who had seen Genesis between December 24th, 2025, and February 16th, 2026, to come forward. That request suggested investigators were struggling to confirm her presence during that window. If neighbors were correct, if Genesis hadn't been seen since around Christmas, then detectives were potentially looking at a disappearance that occurred weeks before the 3 a.m. 911 call. And that changes the psychology of the case entirely. Because an overnight disappearance suggests panic. A weeks-long delay suggests planning. Investigators began digging into every aspect of daily routine. Did Genesis have pediatric appointments scheduled in January? Were their grocery purchases consistent with caring for a toddler? Were diapers, formula, toddler snacks being purchased regularly? Were there photographs taken during that period? Did family members receive updates? Did anyone babysit? Detectives likely requested access to phone photo galleries. Metadata doesn't lie easily. A timestamp can reveal when a photo was taken. And sometimes, even where. If there were no recent photos, that would raise questions. If there were recent photos, but metadata showed they were older than claimed, that would raise more. And then there's communication patterns. In modern investigations, digital silence can be as revealing as digital activity. Did Adrienne text anyone about Genesis in January? Did she mention milestones, illness, play dates? Did she send pictures to friends or relatives? Or did conversations about her daughter quietly fade? Sometimes investigators analyze how language changes over time. If someone stops mentioning a child weeks before reporting them missing, that gap becomes significant. Authorities have not released those findings publicly, but something in that digital reconstruction was strong enough to support the false reporting charge and the prosecutor's statement that Adrienne Reid was the only known suspect. And then another layer emerged. Financial records. Detectives often review bank transactions to understand behavior patterns. Were their purchases consistent with daily child care? Or did spending shift in unusual ways? For example, was there a sudden drop in grocery purchases? Did utilities fluctuate? Was there travel? Were there large withdrawals? Again, police have not detailed those specifics, but in timeline investigations, financial footprints are critical. While investigators were dissecting data, the public remained fixated on one thing: the apology. I'm sorry. Legal experts noted that apologies in court can mean different things. Some defendants apologize for the chaos caused, some for misleading authorities, some out of emotional breakdown. But prosecutors don't typically describe someone as the only known suspect unless they believe the evidence supports deeper wrongdoing. Still, at this stage, Adrienne Reid had only been charged with false reporting. No homicide charge, no abuse charge, no obstruction charge beyond the report itself, which means investigators were still building. Behind the scenes, detectives likely re-examined the apartment with forensic precision. Even if there were no visible signs of forced entry, forensic teams would look for subtle indicators, trace evidence, cleaning agents, luminol reactions, fiber transfers, blood spatter invisible to the naked eye. If something had happened inside that apartment before February 16th, forensic science would eventually speak. And if something had happened elsewhere, the investigators would be searching for environmental clues tied to vehicles, dumpsters, wooded areas, bodies of water. Then there's the human factor. Detectives often bring in behavioral analysts when a timeline feels staged. They examine the 911 call tone, word choice, emotional consistency. Was the caller frantic, calm, inconsistent, overly detailed, vague? Emergency dispatch recordings can be powerful, not because emotion proves guilt, but because patterns matter. If Adrienne described an open door and a missing child, investigators would ask, was the door actually open when officers arrived? Was there evidence it had been opened from outside? Were there footprints? Was the latch damaged? Small details begin to separate reality from narrative. Meanwhile, so the person of interest, Mariah or Mariah, remained an unanswered question. Why introduce that name publicly unless investigators believed she played some role in the timeline? Perhaps she visited during the Christmas to February window. Perhaps she had information about Genesis's whereabouts. Perhaps she witnessed something that didn't align with the 3 a.m. story. Police were careful to clarify she was not a suspect at that time. But that doesn't mean she wasn't important. Sometimes the key to a case isn't the primary suspect. It's the person who saw something small and didn't realize it mattered. As days passed, no confirmed sightings of Genesis surfaced from January or early February. That silence grew louder. In most missing child cases, someone eventually steps forward with a memory. I saw her at the store. She was at the playground. They came to a family gathering. But in this case, the timeline seemed to stretch into a void. And voids in investigations are dangerous because they suggest something wasn't happening or someone wasn't present. Law enforcement agencies continued to coordinate search efforts, ground searches, area canvassing, evidence review. The bond remained at $1 million, cash only. That's not symbolic. That's strategic. It limits the possibility of release. It applies pressure. It signals the seriousness of the case. Inside the detention facility, Adrienne Reid remained held. And outside, the community wrestled with a horrifying possibility. What if Genesis had been gone long before anyone called police? And the psychological weight of that theory cannot be overstated. A toddler does not simply vanish without interaction. If she hadn't been seen since Christmas, where was she? If she was alive in January, who saw her? If she wasn't, when did something happen? Each day without answers hardened the investigation. Detectives likely began constructing two competing theories. Theory 1. Genesis disappeared overnight on February 16th, and the mother lied about details out of panic or fear. Theory 2. Genesis had already been deceased or missing for weeks. and the 3 a.m. call was an attempt to establish a later timeline. The difference between those two theories is massive. One suggests chaos, the other suggests concealment, and concealment requires action. Action leaves traces. Vehicles moving, phones pinging, trash disposal. Moves this case from suspicion to resolution. Because without Genesis being located, the case remains suspended in uncertainty. And uncertainty is both legally and emotionally complex. At this stage in the investigation, law enforcement had identified inconsistencies, secured an arrest for false reporting, and publicly labeled the mother as the only known suspect. But they still did not have what every investigator desperately needs in a case like this: a confirmed physical answer. And what they would uncover next, through either digital recovery, witness testimony, or forensic analysis, would determine whether this case becomes a tragic recovery or something even more devastating. Because in missing child investigations, time does not just pass, it exposes. And the deeper investigators dig into the space between Christmas and that 3 a.m. phone call, the more that silence begins to speak. The next development in this case would not come from rumors. It would come from evidence. And when that evidence surfaces, it may finally explain what those two words in court truly meant. During the investigation, silence had become its own form of evidence. No confirmed sightings, no public breakthrough, no recovery. Just a tightening the fourth week circle of pressure around one person, and an expanding timeline that refused to close neatly. When cases stall publicly, it doesn't mean they stall privately. In fact, that's often when the most intensive work is happening behind the scenes. Detectives revisit everything. They rebuild the timeline hour by hour, then day by day, then week by week. They don't just ask when something happened. They ask what was normal before it stopped being normal. And in Genesis Nova Reid's case, something about normal appeared to have shifted long before February 16th. Investigators likely began mapping routine patterns. What was Adrienne Reid's daily schedule in December? Did that schedule change in January? Did she stop taking Genesis outside? Did neighbors notice fewer sounds? Was there a sudden drop in activity inside the apartment? In apartment complexes, people overhear more than they realize. Footsteps, crying, laughter, music, doors opening and closing, silence, especially when it replaces regular toddler noise, stands out. Detectives may have asked neighbors specific questions. When did you last hear a child's voice? Did you hear crying recently? Did you ever babysit? Did you see the child in January? The more consistent those answers became, the more investigators could narrow their timeline. And that's when cases often pivot, not because of one explosive discovery, but because of dozens of small confirmations that align. Meanwhile, forensic teams would have returned to the apartment more than once. Crime scenes are rarely processed a single time. As theories evolve, so does the scope of evidence collection. If early searches focused on forced entry, later ones may have focused on trace. Cleaning agents leave chemical footprints. Blood leaves microscopic residue. Carpets retain fibers. Trash bins hold discarded evidence. Even if visible signs are absent, forensic analysis can reveal attempts to alter a scene. And if the theory shifted toward something occurring before February 16th, investigators would begin looking for signs of staging. Was the open door truly left unsecured? Were there tool marks? Did the latch function normally? Was there evidence the door had been opened earlier in the evening? Small mechanical details can collapse an entire narrative. At the same time, digital analysts were likely dissecting communication patterns. Investigators often create communication maps, visual diagrams showing who contacted whom, when, and how often. If contact with certain individuals spiked during a specific period, that becomes relevant. That's where the person of interest, the Mariah, sometimes referred to as Mariah, re-enters the picture. Authorities had publicly stated she was not a suspect at that time, but the fact that they believed she may have critical information suggests she intersected with the timeline in some meaningful way. Did she visit during the Christmas to February window? Did she help with childcare? Did she receive unusual messages? Did she notice something different? Sometimes the most important witness doesn't realize they are a witness. Investigators may also have examined rideshare data. Was there a trip taken late at night? Was there a drive into a wooded area? Did any vehicle associated with the household travel unusually long distances during that window? Modern vehicles often store location data internally. GPS systems log history. The even deleted routes can sometimes be recovered. If law enforcement suspected Genesis had been moved, whether alive or not, transportation would be central to the case. And transportation leaves trails. Gas station cameras, highway toll data, automatic license plate readers. Cell phone tower pings along a route. Each breadcrumb narrows the field. While investigators quietly assembled this mosaic, the public remained focused on the emotional dimension. A mother, a missing toddler, an apology in court. But emotionally powerful stories can cloud factual complexity. From a prosecutorial standpoint, the false reporting charge served a purpose. It allowed authorities to detain Adrian Reid while continuing to build their case. It prevented flight. It prevented interference. It applied legal leverage. In many investigations, lesser charges precede more serious ones, but only if evidence justifies escalation. At this stage, no additional charges had been publicly announced, which means investigators were still confirming, verifying, double-checking. Because in a case involving a missing child and potential homicide implications, prosecutors cannot move forward without confidence. Meanwhile, the $1 million cash bond remained in place. That detail matters. It indicates prosecutors argued there was significant concern, either about flight risk, risk to the investigation, or the severity of what they believed had occurred. Judges don't set bonds that high casually. Behind closed doors, detectives likely presented elements of their timeline reconstruction to the district attorney's office. What they believed, what they could prove, what still needed confirmation. The gap between belief and proof is where investigations either succeed or collapse. And in this case, the gap centered on one unresolved fact. Where is Genesis? Without a body, prosecutions become more complex. Not impossible, but more complex. Investigators must rely heavily on digital forensics, witness statements, circumstantial evidence, and behavioral patterns. That's why the Christmas to February window remains so important. If proof of life cannot be established after a certain date, prosecutors may argue that harm occurred before that threshold. But to do so, they would need something definitive, something that closes the timeline. As the investigation deepened, law enforcement publicly urged citizens to ignore online speculation. And that request suggests that rumors were not only circulating, but potentially interfering with witnesses. In high-profile cases, social media can create false memories. People convince themselves they saw something, or they repeat unverified claims. Detectives would need clean testimony, free from contamination. Meanwhile, the psychological aspect of the case intensified. When a caregiver becomes the focal point of an investigation, behavioral analysis often enters the picture. Experts analyze speech patterns, body language, timeline rigidity. Did Adrienne show panic consistent with a missing child? Did she show confusion? Did she offer unsolicited details? Did she over-explain? Again, none of these elements prove guilt alone. But patterns matter. The prosecutor's public statement, calling her the only known suspect, suggests investigators believed those patterns aligned with evidence. Yet still, Genesis remained missing. And that absence grew heavier each day. In missing child cases, time erodes hope. The longer a child remains unaccounted for, the more investigators shift from rescue to recovery. That transition is rarely announced publicly. It simply happens. Search strategies change. Cadaver dogs replace tracking dogs. Wooded areas and waterways become focal points. Even so, authorities maintained that the investigation was ongoing and active. No formal homicide charge had been filed, which means the case at this stage remains suspended between suspicion and confirmation. But Chapter 4 of this story is not about what the public knows, and it's about what investigators are closing in on. Because once a digital timeline is fully reconstructed, once vehicle movements are confirmed, once witness statements align, once forensic analysis returns from the lab, the silence breaks. And when it does, it doesn't whisper. It clarifies. The next development in the Genesis Nova Reid case will likely determine whether this investigation becomes a prosecution for concealment, or something far more severe. Because the deeper detectives dig into the weeks between Christmas and that early morning call, the more one reality becomes unavoidable. The truth is not in the panic of February 16th. It is buried in what happened before it. And when that buried truth surfaces, it may finally answer the question that has haunted Enterprise, Alabama, since the beginning. What was Adrienne Reid sorry for? Behind closed doors, detectives had spent weeks reconstructing the space between Christmas and that early morning 3 a.m. call. They had examined phone records, interviewed neighbors, tracked movements, revisited the apartment, mapped communications, and followed every digital breadcrumb available. When investigators describe someone as the only known suspect, they are signaling confidence, not speculation. But confidence is not a conviction. For a case to move forward, prosecutors must be prepared to prove their theory beyond a reasonable doubt. And in a case where a 2-year-old child is still missing, that burden becomes even heavier. Because the central question remains unresolved. Where is Genesis Nova Reid? As of this chapter, no public announcement has confirmed her recovery. No additional charges beyond false reporting have been formally filed, and no official statement has closed the timeline. But the pressure has not eased. If investigators have determined that Genesis was not alive on February 16th, if they believe something happened weeks earlier, then the 3 a.m. 911 call becomes something else entirely. It becomes staging. Staging is a calculated act. It requires thought. It requires choosing a moment. It requires constructing a narrative, an open door, an empty bed, a frantic call. But staging also requires consistency. And according to authorities, inconsistencies emerged almost immediately. That's why the arrest happened so quickly. False reporting may sound minor compared to the emotional weight of a missing child, but legally, it is a doorway. It allows investigators to detain, question, and apply pressure while they continue building a larger case. And pressure changes things. Pressure creates cracks. Sometimes those cracks appear in private conversations, sometimes in recorded phone calls, sometimes in digital searches, sometimes in statements made when someone believes no one is listening. Investigators often monitor jailhouse communications. Phone calls made from detention facilities are recorded. Letters are reviewed. Conversations with visitors are documented. If something was said that contradicted earlier statements, that would become evidence. If instructions were given to someone outside, that too would become evidence. If panic replaced composure, investigators would notice. But even without additional public disclosures, the weight of the case has already shifted. Genesis was 2 years old. 2 years old. A child whose entire world was contained within the walls of her home and the adults who cared for her. In cases like this, the truth often narrows to a small circle of people. Investigators don't need dozens of suspects. They need clarity within the household. And clarity appears to be what they are closing in on. The $1 million cash bond remains a symbol of seriousness. Judges set bonds based on risk of flight, risk of interference, risk of further harm. Prosecutors argued that Adrienne Reed was the only known person who knew where Genesis was. That language carries legal implications. It signals belief that the truth is not missing. It is withheld. And withholding the truth in a case involving a missing toddler transforms the moral dimension of the investigation. As time continues to pass, one possibility grows stronger. If Genesis had not been seen since Christmas, and if digital or witness evidence confirms that timeline, then the disappearance did not happen overnight. It happened quietly, and the 3 a.m. phone call was not the start. It was the reveal. But here's what makes this case especially haunting. There has been no dramatic press conference announcing a discovery, no public declaration of closure, no confirmation that Genesis has been found. The story remains open, and open cases are the hardest to tell, because they live in the space between suspicion and proof. The apology in court, "I'm sorry," lingers in that space. 2 words. 2 words that could mean regret over lying, or regret over something irreversible. Investigators know which one it is. They are simply waiting until the evidence is complete enough to present it in court. Because in a courtroom, emotion does not matter. Proof does. Until that moment arrives, Genesis Nova Reid remains at the center of a case defined by absence. An absent child, an absent confirmed timeline, an absent final explanation. But absence does not mean mystery forever. Modern investigations are patient. Data does not decay. Records do not disappear. Digital trails remain. And eventually, timelines converge. When they do, the next announcement in this case will not be about inconsistencies. It will be about accountability. Whether that accountability takes the form of upgraded charges, or whether new information reshapes the narrative entirely, the truth will surface. It always does. For now, what we know is this. On February 16, 2026, A 3 a.m. phone call brought police to an apartment in Enterprise, Alabama. Within 24 hours, the mother who made that call was arrested for false reporting. Prosecutors described her as the only known suspect and the only person believed to know where Genesis is. And a 2-year-old girl named Genesis Nova Reid remains missing. This case is ongoing. And until Genesis is found, or until the courts deliver answers, the story is not finished. If you've been following this investigation, stay informed through official updates. Avoid spreading unverified rumors. And remember that at the center of every headline is a child whose life mattered. We will continue to follow developments in this case as they unfold. Because somewhere inside this timeline, between Christmas and that 3 a.m. call, the truth is waiting. And when it finally comes into the light, it will answer the question that has echoed since the beginning. What really happened to Genesis Nova Reid?